All right, welcome to our discussion here for chapters 1 through 5 for Slaughterhouse-5. Basically, what we're going to do is we're going to run through some major themes that show up in the book. Now, that's not to say these are the only themes that are present, but these are certainly ones that are starting to make themselves pretty apparent here in the first 5 chapters, and certainly they'll continue on into chapters 6 to 10. Some themes will even pick up a little bit more in detail and significance as we progress throughout the rest of the book. We're going to take a general look at some themes that are in the book, specifically 5 of them. And then with those themes, take a look at some passages briefly that resonate with that theme, and then also do a little bit of a rundown of each chapter, not going over like overall plot, but just some like main concepts that are kind of creeping into those chapters so that we have an idea as to the significance, relevance of those chapters. Certainly any questions that you have beyond what gets covered in this presentation, we can certainly go over, and we'll probably do some Zoom discussions coming up for those who are interested in trying to get a little bit better understanding of what's happening within the novel. So, to get started, the themes that we're going to look at specifically are going to be time and memory, the overall structure of the book, narrative versus non-narrative, since the book, while it is a fictional novel with characters and for the most part a plot, it certainly doesn't fit the typical structure of how most novels are, in the sense that it is not linear, but it's very spastic and that it bounces around quite a bit. We'll take a look at people versus the forces that kind of control them and whether or not free will exists. And this is certainly an issue that the Tralfamadorians take up with Billy Pilgrim a little bit. We'll also be looking at acceptance, and with acceptance is certainly going to be the key phrase within the book that appears quite often, so it goes. And certainly so it goes does consider itself to be a motif. So a lot of times I think we think of a motif as being an image or a symbol or a concept, such as the briefcase, blindness, and whatnot with Invisible Man. But it can even be, just a phrase all the time. And so certainly So It Goes fits that description here. And then the last aspect is going to be human dignity, with war certainly being the focal point, but then also somewhat kind of beyond that. And that's one that really is going to pick up the human dignity beyond war, that is going to pick up really in chapters 6 to 10 a little bit. So some things with time and memory to take into account. Certainly the science fiction elements of the novel include time travel. I mean, the aliens appear, and that's something that makes it a little bit interesting and different and very unique to read, I think, especially within high school. Billy leaps in time, experiences his life's events out of order and repeatedly. So certainly Dresden ends up being the main focal point, but we don't get that linear structure that tends to come through. He learns on the alien world of Tralfamador that all time happens simultaneously, and so thus no one really ever dies. And you really kind of get that description when Tralfamadorians look at people. They don't see an individual with 2 arms and 2 legs, but it's almost like a centipede, a millipede, where you see the baby legs, and then legs of youth, and then middle age and elderly legs and whatnot. So they see everything that happens, and you're able to focus on whichever part of life that you want to look at. So it can be sort of a happy, pleasant way to look at life, knowing that no one really dies. But this permanence also kind of has a bit of a dark side to it, because brutal acts such as war are going to continue to live on forever. So World War I, World War II, the U.S. Civil War, those events did happen, have happened, always will happen, always do happen. That can't necessarily be changed. So that is the catch that is happening. And so memory is one of those important themes because of the memories. Vonnegut and Billy, the nonfiction of Kurt Vonnegut, the fiction of Billy, cannot move past the Dresden Massacre. So it's very similar with, J.D. Salinger, Catcher in the Rye. We talked about PTSD and not being able to move past those elements of World War II and the loss of innocence. That same thing happens with Dresden. Billy leaps back in time to Dresden again and again. But at critical points in the book is when we see that Dresden simply because Billy relives it in his memory. And so in that regard, I think one part of the book that makes it seem so foreign to us is the fact that time travel does not exist, at least within our minds, but the idea of memories do. And so we do have that ability to time travel, where we can always go to certain elements from our past and relive those. And in a way, that is what Billy is doing figuratively through that time travel. Somewhat kind of like Siddhartha, we talked about, where there's that 4th dimension where you're able to view things differently with that manipulation of time. And that's the way that the Tralfamadorians are looking at human existence. So some passages to kind of emphasize this point quite a bit with this idea of time and memory, and the passage of it certainly could be something like Jan Janssen. It's something that continually repeats itself over and over and over again. With it appearing on page 2, it certainly introduces us to a work that is going to be not linear and circles around on itself. But just as things cannot, you always come back to the beginning of it with the poem with Jan Janssen. It's always going to come back to Dresden. Billy's not going to be able to escape that. Vonnegut knows that he cannot escape that. I mean, chapter 1, when this appears, is really him kind of setting the stage as to why he has to write this book. And he's not writing it necessarily for an entertainment value, but he has to write it because it's something that he has to do for himself as a moment of catharsis almost, so that he can try to move past what has happened with Dresden and his memory. And while it might not be something that he can ever fully move past and forget about, it gives him a way to try to deal with that at least somewhat. You'll also notice that there's a lot of phrases, and these aren't all of them, but I put it here: mustard gas and roses, blue and ivory, orange and black, three musketeers, that keep coming back to themselves over and over again. So, for example, blue and ivory can be, feet that are described of the little boy and the little German boy when Roland and Billy are being captured, but it's also Billy's feet sometimes when he's looking down at himself in the bathroom. Or orange and black, the tents for the wife's wedding at the beginning of chapter 4 are orange and black, but then also the boxcars that Billy is on the way to Dresden are painted orange and black. So this idea that things always kind of come back, and there is a grounding that takes place within the book, where even though it does seem to be very spastic, there's a bit of an order that does kind of take place. So you see these things that at least allow for a sense of cohesiveness to be there, that it's not just a simple rambling. And also, with things such as PTSD, certainly little things can trigger memories. And so when he sees something like orange and black, those colors next to one another, that can trigger a memory of going back to the boxcars, on his way to Dresden, and can make him go, to that memory, even certainly at times when he does not want to. And that's an important thing to keep in mind with Billy. While he does time travel, he's not in control of where he goes. And so really he's kind of a victim in this way, that he's not allowed to be the one to kind of determine when he's going to go. Certainly with the context of this thinking now in Vonnegut's mind, you could think that this is something that he would not want to try to remember. But he makes this allusion to Lot, from the Bible. And in the Old Testament, you have two cities, Sodom and Gomorrah, that are places of sin. And they ultimately are destroyed by a fireball that God sends down. But the angel comes to Lot and his family and tells them that they can leave and they will be saved. The only requirement is they do not look back. But Lot's wife does not listen, and when they are fleeing the city, she does look back, and her punishment is she's turned into a pillar of salt. And so at the end of chapter 1, Vonnegut does make the point that this book is written by a pillar of salt, and he loves her for that, Lot's wife, because she does look back, and that's something so human. So there certainly is a separation between who Vonnegut and Billy are as individuals, that it's not meant to be the same person. Vonnegut certainly is going to be the nonfiction, the historical, factual writer, person who has lived through these things. Billy is a separation of him. So Billy is used as a vehicle to certainly address a lot of points, but by no means is Vonnegut using Billy as an example of who you should be. And also with memory and time, that movie scene in reverse with the dropping of the bombs, instead of them being dropped going into the airplanes and the airplanes going backwards and landing and being disassembled, is kind of like a neat scene to read, and it would be one that would be wonderful to kind of recreate in a cinematic way. But basically the idea that all of us do have this potential of some kind of innocence that could take place, because even Hitler is one that goes back to being even a baby with these scenes in reverse. And so that's certainly something that kind of shows how or can illustrate how time is potentially manipulated in a lot of different ways. I think the part of the book that a lot of people certainly take note of right away, especially once chapter 2 begins, is the non-narrative form. And a lot of people try to identify a genre for the book, and some are going to identify as being science fiction. Satire certainly would be applicable. An anti-war novel is something that's mentioned quite a bit. But with this narrative versus being a non-narrative, this is a broad theme that really encompasses a lot of important ideas. Vonnegut's interested in protecting his novel from becoming a conventional war narrative. And, a Hemingway book like For Whom the Bell Tolls or A Farewell to Arms certainly fits this conventional kind of structure that Vonnegut is trying to disassociate with. Um, he wants to stay away from that conventional war book, the kind of conventional narrative that can sometimes make war look like something exciting or fun. And from last year, All Quiet on the Western Front would certainly kind of fit this narrative form. Now, not something where it's trying to make war look fun, because that's certainly not Remarque's point, but he's not trying to glamorize it in any way whatsoever. So throughout the book, we see narratives of this kind in history texts and the minds of characters, but this novel is more interested in non-narrative, like the nonsense question that's asked by the birds at the novel's ends with Puduit, or like the out-of-order leaping through the many parts of Billy life. Vonnegut does not want to write a book about heroes, because in essence, really, Billy Pilgrim is more of a victim. And, the Mary O'Hare passage at the beginning conversation that Vonnegut, while not dealing with this structurally, certainly is looking at the key point that he does not want this book to be something that's going to be glamorous or fun or heroic, that is going to be portrayed by famous movie stars in Hollywood. And so he makes the promise to Mary O'Hare that if he does this, it's going to be something different. And so that's certainly what he does do. Page 22 at the end of the first chapter with Puduit, nonsensical, comment made by the birds, and it's actually a question, as we can notice syntactically, and it's a question we cannot answer. But he lets us know at the very beginning, essentially, how this book is going to end. And I'm sure some of you, did flip to the back of the book to see if that's how the book actually does come to a conclusion by the time you get to page 215, and lo and behold, there it is. So, these passages help to kind of identify that, that structure is going to be different. Page 30 in chapter 2 is when we have that Billy first becoming unstuck in time, and that's really helps us kind of illustrate that this is something that is kind of beyond his control, that it's not something that he really does on his own. But he first came unstuck in time while World War II was in progress, when he was the chaplain's assistant in the war, in that final paragraph on page 30. So at that point, we can tell that things are going to be a little bit different here. And page 88 is interesting, where you get the description of Tralfamadorian books, where Billy kind of describes them as being telegrams. But when you look at each book, a Tralfamadorian book, you're really looking at an urgent message. You're describing a situation, a scene. Tralfamadorians read them all at once, not one after the other. There isn't any particular relationship between all the messages, except that the author has chosen them carefully so that when seen all at once, they produce an image of life that is beautiful and surprising and deep. There is no beginning, no middle, no end, no suspense, no moral, no causes, no effects. But what we love in our books are the depths of many marvelous moments seen all at one time. And really, that's something that it seems that Vonnegut might be trying to replicate with Slaughterhouse-5, that with it being so sporadic and the moments kind of just jumping all over the place, you're looking at how all of these moments kind of coexist together and produce an image of life that can be beautiful and surprising and deep, not something that's going to be taking place in that traditional linear form of a typical novel. People versus forces, and this is really where that kind of idea of free will can start to appear. With this, the theme is closely connected to the idea of the narrative, that we're just going over. Vonnegut's characters have almost really no kind of agency about them. There's not something there's not any kind of action or urgency that goes with them, but they are driven by forces that are simply too huge for any one man to make much of a difference. And so Vonnegut drives home this point by introducing us to the Tralfamadorians and their concept of time, in which all events are fated and impossible to change. And so that Tralfamadorian viewpoint of time and fate is that no, we have no free will. We're not someone who is able to determine where we're going to go. All of that is already kind of being done for us. And this can be a difficult theme, I think, for a lot of readers to grapple with, because depending certainly on some philosophical and spiritual beliefs, we like to think that we have control over our own future, our fate, our destiny. But the Tralfamadorian, with seeing all those messages that come together at once, all those scenes, that happened at one time. They know what it will be, what it was in the past, how it is in the present, how it will be in the future, and there's no reason to kind of deviate. So you just kind of pick and choose what elements you want to look at. And Billy, I think, kind of has a lot of these aspects within him. Where at times it seems that there is no action about him, but he is simply asleep and in a state of barely any kind of wakefulness. He struggles with narcolepsy, and so he is a character that is kind of sleepwalking through things. And when you think of a passive, victim type character, that would be a way to kind of describe him. Tralfamadorians on 86 talk about only on Earth is there any talk of free will. With all the planets and universes and galaxies that they have visited within the universe, only on Earth is that something that we think where we have free will. And so is there some kind of, whether it be a higher power or fate controlling us, or do we have the ability to kind of pick and choose what we want? From a religious standpoint, Vonnegut's agnostic, so he's not Christian and doesn't really look at religious aspects having control over us. And this is something I think that he wants us to try to get away from, where we do have the ability to do things. And this is where he is not saying that Billy Pilgrim is the idea of who we should be, but I think more of a satirical representation of what we have become, especially when you consider the publication of this book during the Vietnam War in 1969. War is raging on, but a lot of folks are just going, that's the way it is, so it goes. Much like Harrison Starr in the book talks about, if you're going to write an anti-war book, you may as well write an anti-glacier book because they're always going to be there. That's a mindset, that's a viewpoint that Vonnegut certainly wants us to try to change. For acceptance, and so it goes, certainly becoming the big phrase. It's one of the book's most famous lines. It probably is the book's most famous line, and is repeated whenever a character dies. And it doesn't even have to be a character, but it can be items where champagne loses its bubbles, the carbonation, and it dies, and so it goes. But Billy Pilgrim is a deeply passive and accepting everything that kind of ends up befalling of him. And I think with So It Goes, it's something that can be very liberating for folks. It's a way to kind of view things that, okay, I cannot control this, so I'm going to let it be. It's almost like a benediction of sorts. If you take a look at Amen, the Hebrew term, literally in Hebrew, a translation would be so be it or it is so. And so at the end of a prayer, so be it, it is so, so it goes, is kind of resonates with that same kind of concept to it. So it is almost as if a prayer, and amen, after every time that character does kind of come to its end, to its demise. One of the nice things about it is that it allows him to accept everything. It makes him able to forgive anyone for anything, and he never seems to become angry. But at the same time, this acceptance has its problems. So when Billy drives through the Black Ghetto and ignores the suffering that he sees there on his way to his Lions meeting, we see the problem with complete acceptance. There's no urgency to try to change anything at all. Vonnegut values the forgiveness and peace that comes with acceptance, but his novel could not be an anti-war book if it called on readers to completely accept their world. And so again, this is where that KV, that Kurt Vonnegut, does not equal Billy Pilgrim, where they are, two differing viewpoints. Billy is the epitome of acceptance, and almost, not almost, but basically to the point of a fault, where it lacks any kind of true urgency to do anything to maybe make the world a better place. And so it goes, not 6+ since 6 times, but appears on page 6 and basically appears everywhere throughout the rest of the book. The Serenity Prayer that first appears on page 60 will continue to kind of be a symbolic reference. God grant me the serenity to accept things and recognize the things that one can change and what cannot, and to know the difference kind of encompasses this idea. There is the illustration of the tombstone with the epitaph, everything was beautiful and nothing hurt. That certainly kind of encompasses that acceptance. And then on 125, when Billy is at the latrine in the POW camp in Dresden, you have the line, not the line, but the part at the bottom of page 125 where he comes in, where he meets Vonnegut, sees Vonnegut, and Vonnegut, writes, "That was I, that was me, that was the author of this book." That's important to keep in mind, that they are two distinct, again, separate people. And I don't mean to keep harping on this point over and over again, but I think you will see a lot of misanalysis and criticism of the book where, oh, Vonnegut just wants people to accept the way that things are and be happy and not worry about things. And no, he wants the exact opposite. I think he wants us to notice things that we maybe have accepted too much before, that we haven't taken the urgency to truly realize. And that's where there is an important separation between who he is as a writer, as a person, and who Kurt Vonnegut is as a character. And then human dignity, and this kind of comes back to that Mary O'Hare conversation, but the idea that war is not heroic or glamorous. It's messy, it's often disgusting, and it robs men of their dignity. And the problem of dignity comes up again and again in the novel, as we see how easily that human dignity can not be denied by others. But Vonnegut also questions some conceptions of dignity, and he sees that they have a place in creating conventional war narratives that make war look heroic, but he's trying to avoid that. And if you take notice of the novel's title page, as you open the book and you get to right before his dedication, Slaughterhouse-5 or The Children's Crusade, A Duty Dance with Death. And keep in mind that he promises to Mary O'Hare that he's going to refer to the book as The Children's Crusade, that it's not going to be a heroic depiction as the way that war is made to be glamorous. And so that remembrance of the Children's Crusade, and historically you can look up the Children's Crusade and certainly see how that kind of matches up with some of the ideas that Vonnegut's trying to get across. And even Billy in himself, I think, kind of ends up being a little bit of a childlike character where he is in this crusade as a child. Some passages or examples, you have references when Roland Weary, our bacon-smelling person from Pittsburgh, shows up in the book. He's kind of the antithesis as to what Mary O'Hare wants, because he is someone in pages 42, 43, coming up with the term the Three Musketeers, wants to be heroic. War is his opportunity to kind of change the narrative of his life, where he's not going to accept the way that he was viewed by other people, but wants now to kind of have this glamorous, heroic aspect. And that gets juxtaposed very quickly on page 45 with the allusion to Eddie Slovik, who historically, is a historical figure, an actual person. He is tried for treason, for deserting his post in World War II, and is ultimately executed of it. So these are individuals who are either looking to gain dignity or have it kind of stripped away within the context of World War II. The Englishman's views of dignity in the concentration camp certainly is a little bit different, because theirs is all about kind of appearance and whatnot. Maybe not the type of dignity that a person has on the inside, but they're worried about having the fashionable, flashy look, saying the right things, carrying yourself in a certain way so that you have that dignity and that's not taken away from you in a POW camp. And I think Edgar Derby ends up being one of those, potential heroic kind of characters in the book that you look at as a person who does have dignity and is not a person who blindly accepts the world with so it goes. But if he can make some kind of change, he is a person who's ultimately going to try to do that. Just some things here that I wanted to kind of highlight with each of the chapters and kind of like the purpose behind it. I think one of the main things with chapter 1, and I kind of align it with a prologue from Invisible Man in a way, that it's separate from the narrative that starts on chapter 2 and goes on to chapter 9. This allows the reader to see Kurt Vonnegut as being separate from Billy Pilgrim. Yes, Dresden is a big part of who Vonnegut is, and it's the reason that he is writing the book. As mentioned, it's kind of like a cathartic experience for him of sorts, but there's no way to end the memory of Dresden, but he's certainly trying to deal with it. And when you think about it, the book gets published in 1969. That's almost 25 years after the bombing of Dresden in February of 46. And the destruction that would have taken place in Dresden, there's not a certain finite number of lives that were lost. You'll see estimates ranging from about 150 to over 350,000. I think it's pretty widely accepted that roughly 200 to 250,000 people died at the initial bombing of Dresden in February, on the 13th, 14th, and 15th of 1946. That would be roughly the same number of people who died with the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, certainly with the atomic bomb, there were more deaths later with the effects of radiation, but for the immediate impact, the death count for Dresden is pretty much on par with those. So it is a significant loss of life, and it's something that by Vonnegut being present in Dresden at the time, it's going to be a moment that he's certainly an experience that he's not going to be able to forget at any time. So for him, he has to kind of look back at this experience and find some way to write about it, much like Lot's wife, where Vonnegut refers to himself as being a pillar of salt for having to look back and write the book. Chapter 2, we get this introduction, to kind of Billy Pilgrim, and one of the things I think is important to look at is his name. Why Billy and why Pilgrim? Why not William or Will or Bill? And as I mentioned, I think Billy makes him very childlike, which kind of mimics the kind of character that he seems to be. Not necessarily immature, but in a childlike acceptance kind of stage throughout the course of his life. And he's a pilgrim. He's going on a journey. He's traveling, in time throughout a lot of the book. So he kind of matches up with that idea of being on a pilgrimage. And certainly his viewpoint of looking at things, I think, also fits in line with him professionally. He's an optometrist. His job is to help people to see better, to see differently. And by him trying to kind of spread the gospel of the Tralfamadorian, so to speak, he wants us to look at things in a different light and a different lens. And so him spreading this certainly matches up with his idea of trying to help people see as an optometrist. Tells us, right off the bat that Billy Pilgrim was born in 1922 in Ilium, New York. If you look at a map of New York State, there is not an Ilium, but there is Troy. And Troy, New York is an actual place. And Ilium is the ancient spelling or the pronunciation, the term that would be used with Troy. And when you think about what Troy was, Troy was a city that is destroyed. The Trojan horse during the wartime. It is something that Billy is basically coming from a place that is a massacre, and now he is stuck in this massacre place throughout the rest of his life. So I do think there is some purposeful matching with saying that he be from Ilium. Also, he's born in 1922. There is a parallel there with Kurt Vonnegut, also born in 1922, but in Indianapolis, Indiana. But the idea of him coming from Ilium, sets up that he's a person who is always going to kind of be aligned with destruction and cities that are being utterly destroyed. And that certainly, allows for a connection to occur with Dresden, New York as well. And then Roland Weary mentioned him being mentioned, it sounded a little redundant, being mentioned in the book. Roland Weary being introduced into the book, essentially an antithesis of Billy Pilgrim, an antithesis really of what Mary O'Hare wants to find in the depiction of the way that people are going to approach war. Chapter 3, we already kind of touched a lot on this with the acceptance and the idea of Billy ignoring the situation in the ghetto, and this reinforces again that Vonnegut's not Billy Pilgrim. He doesn't preach blind acceptance. His sons are not going to partake in a massacre, but Billy's son Robert is a Green Beret. So, again, there's still that kind of separation that would be taking place. You do have some religious illusion happening here as well, not only with the Serenity Prayer, but with Adam and Eve, and that all people kind of going back to Adam and Eve when you look at the boy, when Roland and Billy are being captured with that innocence of Adam and Eve, but that innocence of all of us is kind of getting lost, and war is one of those main ways, ultimately, in which that tends to happen. So we're trying to have things occur differently so that maybe that can be brought up again. War movie in reverse, already mentioned about Hitler being a baby, and we all can return to the perfection of Adam and Eve, and that innocence, that potential is there. But, it's something that if we just go with so it goes, that innocence is not going to be brought back. I think a lot of folks have questions while reading, like, are the aliens real? And I don't mean to dismiss the question. In a lot of ways, I think it doesn't matter if they're real or not. To Billy, they are. But you have now, this incorporation of Kilgore Trout, science fiction writer. And Trout really plays a larger part in those chapters 6 through 10. And I think we kind of start to realize that this is kind of a coping mechanism for Billy Pilgrim more than anything. That if it doesn't make sense through a human eye, through the human lens, then maybe it'll make sense through some kind of foreign lens, and this being the Tralfamadorians of an alien species allows it to happen. You keep in mind that not Vonnegut, but Billy Pilgrim is introduced to Kilgore Trout by Elliot Rosewater while he is in the VA hospital. And so this is certainly a time that he's susceptible, dealing with PTSD, and this gives him a means of dealing with those issues. And so that idea of science fiction and time travel and aliens could certainly be a seductive idea, and that kind of begins to encompass who he is. again, with the Tralfamadorians kind of playing a larger role in this chapter, I think it's important to remember that Vonnegut doesn't want us to blindly accept these things, and that kind of harkens back to Vietnam in 1969 when this book is getting published, that as you have travesties that are happening not in the U.S. necessarily, but in other places, and we just allow it to happen and accept that it's going to happen because war is war, and that's the way things are. That no, you can't look at it that way because there's still a loss of life, and we have to be diligent in recognizing that there are some things that humans can do. And so chapter 5, you really kind of see that human dignity, that lack of it, really being conceptualized as Billy's laughed at by his German captors. He's becoming mentally unhinged. He's berated by his daughter Barbara. He's annoyed by his mother every time she comes to visit. He's going to be married to a woman that he does not really love or respect, and he has to parade himself, nakedly in an alien zoo for all spectators. Billy certainly has maybe a nice way of looking at things by accepting all, but really that human dignity, the things that we really want, that respect, the value, the feel that we have a purpose in life, those things are all pretty much being taken away from him. And contrast this with the way the British prisoners make war look stylish and reasonable and fun. They've been these prisoners for these 4 years. They've come up with heroic ways to kind of survive what's happening as a POW. But real war strips away dignity. It doesn't create it. War should not romanticize what it does with that viewpoint of dignity, but it really does actually strip it away. And so Vonnegut does not provide reasoning nor cause and effect of war. We just simply get this question from the birds with poo to eat. And when you think of that as being a question, since we don't know what it means as a question, we can't answer it. And when you think about war, what is the purpose of it? What does it accomplish? In a lot of ways, that's a question that we can't necessarily even answer. So I think that the inclusion of that, and it's, humans can't say anything about war, but only the birds can, only the animals can. Those who are outside of the actual catastrophe of the battles are able to kind of comment on it. And that's what's happening with the Tralfamadorians a little bit as well. Billy can't find answers within his own life, so he has to kind of create some other kind of aspect to do that. But Vonnegut would certainly hope that as humans we're able to better recognize the power, the ability that we can have, and the change that we could potentially make within the world. I hope you've enjoyed the first 5 chapters of Slaughterhouse-5, and we'll continue to take a look at chapters 6 through 10 next week. If you have any questions about what's going on in the book, please feel free to let me know. But I hope you're enjoying it, and look forward to talking to you soon.